again, everyone. All right, I hope you're enjoying these first sessions of the World Bank Youth Summit and that you've had the opportunity to deliver on some of these 3 challenges that I gave you this morning. It is my great pleasure to be here with Annette Dixon. Annette is the Vice President for Human Development at the World Bank Group. In that capacity, she oversees the global practices for education, health, nutrition, and population, gender, social protection, and jobs. Previously, she was the World Bank Vice President for the South Asia region, where she was overseeing operations and projects worth more than $10 billion per year. Throughout her career at the World Bank, Annette has championed initiatives aimed at increasing human potential, from supporting the launch of a helpline for survivors of gender-based violence in Nepal to increasing opportunity in Afghanistan during times of economic uncertainty. Prior to joining the World Bank in 1999, Annette was working for the government of New Zealand as Chief Executive of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Youth Affairs.
Of Youth Affairs. I'm sorry, all right,
yeah,
Youth
very
Affairs.
Relevant.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Annette, for joining us for this fireside chat. I have 2 questions to start this conversation with you. The first one is, human capital has become a bit of a buzzword recently, but you were already working on human development in Europe and Central Asia when you first joined the bank. So hasn't human capital always been important? And can you tell us a little bit, building on your experience working on building human capital in different countries and different regions, about the link between human capital and poverty, and why it has become so important for the World Bank Group?
Well, thanks very much. And actually, even going back further, I started my professional life actually as a youth worker. And my first job in development was as a youth development worker, which is kind of why this whole summit is actually so exciting, because I think it's really, I think, emblematic of why it's, and the Human Capital Project itself is something that young people care deeply about. So, of course, human development or human capital has always been important. The simple answer, it's even more important than ever. Now, we know that, and we really just, the evidence has been keeping up is just catching up with what we've always known, that investing in good health and good education is morally the right thing to do. What we have is a much clearer evidential line of sight, if you like, that if you invest in good health and education outcomes, it will help countries to develop. And that's because people are more productive, they can contribute more, and that helps countries to get richer, and getting richer actually reduces poverty. So it's really just that's important. But actually how important it is something that we now know. We've just produced about a year ago a report called The Wealth of Nations. And for the first time ever, we measured human capital as part of total wealth. So you know, and if those of you who have studied economics, we know that physical capital is been measured for a long, long time. In the last couple of decades, we've started measuring natural capital, so the endowments in the natural environment and land and forests and so on. And now we've added an accounting of human capital. And really what it really shows is just how important it is. So across the world, there is a huge difference between developed and developing countries. So in the developed, advanced world, if you like, human capital accounts for 70% of wealth, which is a huge amount. And those are the countries that do have the best investment or the biggest investment in infrastructure as well. But even so, human capital accounts for 70%. Whereas in developing countries, it's about 41%. So it makes up a huge difference in the gap between developed and developing countries. Now, we know individually that some of the things that are important in human development, if we invest in them, it improves the productivity of a country. So, for example, we care a lot at the bank about stunting. And stunting is a technical term, sounds awful, and it's really a measure of height for age of young kids. And it's important because it's a proxy for something that's even more important, which is the development of the young child, and particularly the brain development, because the brain development a lot of it takes place when the child is still in the mother's uterus, and if a child is born stunted, then it actually has affected their brain development. And so we've started really paying a lot of attention to this measure, because in developing countries, quite large numbers of kids are not actually fully developed to their full potential as they might otherwise be. So we know, for example, an average country would have 7% more GDP per head of population today if they eliminated stunting. So it's just hugely important. It's obviously important for the life chances of an individual child, but when you aggregate it, it's something that makes a powerful difference in the overall country. So I said it's even more important, and that gets to the next part of the story, which is what's happening in the world. And that's, of course, technology is actually changing the world dramatically, and it's changing the nature of jobs and work. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether technology reduces jobs that are available for people, or whether it actually creates new jobs. And actually, we think it's a mixture of all of the above. So some jobs, relatively small number of jobs, totally disappear when technology comes in. Some new jobs are created that didn't exist before, but a lot of jobs are made more complex because technology adds to the complexity of the work that's done. It allows people to do even more. And so that adds up to a need for even better human capital. It's obvious that no matter what, people need to be even better educated, healthier, in order to be productive in the world of the future.
Right, now that's very interesting. And one innovation that the World Bank Group has come up with is the Human Capital Index. We actually did a Facebook poll before the Youth Summit started with our audience here as well as online. And the Human Capital Index was one of the key topics that our audience wanted to learn more about. So can you tell us a little bit more about the Human Capital Index? What does it measure? How does it work? And were there any trends or lessons that actually surprised you?
Yeah, well, hands up those who have actually looked at this. Looked at it online, yeah. So one of the cool things you can do, you can look up there's 157 countries included in the index. So about 30 countries missed out. So for most of you, you'll be able to look up and see what the Human Capital Index says about your own particular country. And what we've done is we've actually put together an index that measures those human development outcomes that we know have a really important link to productivity and growth. So it's not everything that we know is important in human development, but those things that we have a strong evidential link, and those things that we have a lot of data across countries. So everything that's in the index we know is important, but not everything that's important is in the index. So that's just something to bear in mind. Now, the index considers three things. Firstly, survival. Will a child born today live long enough to begin school? And that's, will kids survive till 5 years old? How much schooling will that child complete? And most importantly, what will they learn? What are the learning years that they will actually leave school with? And will they leave school in good health, ready for further learning, and able to work fully as a productive adult? And that's the probability that a 15-year-old kid will survive to age 60. So the index actually is really interesting because it's gender disaggregated. And some of these things that are in this index are things we've known about for a long time. But there's one thing that's really new and important, and this is this new metric for figuring out not just how many years of enrollment kids have in a country, but how much years of learning do they leave with. And that gives us a number which we're calling the learning gap. Now, what we did is this index essentially measures between 0 and 1, and 1 is the full potential of health and education that a child could have. And then we rank the countries according to this. So we have countries from 157 to 1. Now, one thing that's important is no country got to 1. The highest country is at 0.88, and that's Singapore. And it's interesting because even Singapore is investing more in better health and education for their young people. They're doing more in early childhood, and they're doing more in post-school learning. So that's important. There's something in this index for every country. There's no country that is there because, as I said, the bar is rising on all countries. They have to make sure that their kids are even healthier and better educated. Now, what we're trying to do is to get countries to actually look at not just how much they're investing in the human capital outcomes of their population, but how effective is it? And so that's why the metric like this learning gap is really important, because a country could invest anything up to 14 years, but only be getting 12 or 11 years of learning outcomes. So a lot of it is actually helping countries to actually work out whether they're actually effective enough in the outcomes that they're getting, even for the money that they're spending. So what did we learn from this? Well, one thing I think is that in all of these rankings that we see in human development, one thing that's really important is that countries that do really well on these indices are countries that have very high equity of outcomes. They don't have a lot of young people left behind who are not actually benefiting. So they actually spend a lot of time basically getting everybody to come along. So if kids, for example, have been in school for a couple of years and are still not reading, they get a lot of remedial help to get them on their way. So that's really important. Second thing is that this is not something that you just fix overnight. Countries that actually do well pay a lot of attention to this over successive decades. And even during tough times, they continue to invest in better health services and better education. And there's some quite interesting and important cases around the world where countries have actually made this a priority over successive political cycles, and in good times and in not so good times, that has really made the difference. And Singapore itself is an example of a country that has done that. Thirdly, a lot of what goes on in a country is actually, varies across the country. So there are regional differences. There may be differences which are driven by other disparities or inequities that are in the society. And so it's really important that countries look not just at their national data, but they look at the subnational level to look at differences across states or provinces or regions, that they look at differences for different ethnic groups and so on. Lesson number 4 is this is something that takes a whole of government approach. You don't get good health and education outcomes just by paying attention to health and education services. There's lots of other things that are really important for this. So, for example, we know that for poor families, if they don't have access to social safety nets, they have no capacity to deal with shocks. So if there's a drought or flood and their crops are wiped out, if they don't have access to safety nets, then that impacts immediately on the family's well-being. So there are a lot of things, water, sanitation, infrastructure, roads, accessing, if a kid has to walk more than 5 kilometres to school, are they actually going to go to school every day? Because it just is so exhausting for the kid. So there's a lot that goes into making these results come about. And then the last thing that's really important are the demographic trends in a country. Because we know that countries that have done really well in terms of growing their way out of poverty, if you think about, I mean, the classic examples are a lot of the East Asian countries. They did well by hitting, for those of you who come from cricket-playing countries, what we call the sweet spot. And you hit the sweet spot in these demographic transitions when you invest more in human development outcomes, you have better health and education in your population, and you bring the population growth down. And this is important because a lot of countries have very high fertility rates, and they can't grow the economy fast enough to actually improve the living standards. So you get these demographic transitions when you get the population growth coming down. And this is important because no country's actually had one of these demographic dividends or demographic transitions, as we call them, with a fertility rate of higher than 4, an average of 4 children, 4 live children per woman. And we have a lot of countries in the world that still have very high fertility rates, much higher than that. So it's going to be really important for that to be improved, as well as improving the health and education outcomes, so you get to this sweet spot.
These are really impactful lessons for governments worldwide. I wonder, which among these ingredients are, in your opinion, the key ingredients for governments to increase the human potential of their population, and how are you and the World Bank helping those countries to make sure that they are making more and better investments in human capital?
Well, I think one thing, just by doing the index, we're actually making the data available to all of you. And that actually is a really important part of this, because, you know, governments are often very focused on the political cycle. And as I said, this is something that actually that governments need to keep doing, and they need to, it's urgent and important, but usually it's not as urgent as other things seem to be, or the results don't come as quickly as other things that they can do. So just by making the data available, we really hope that we will give you a lot of information that will actually enable you to engage in an informed public policy discussion in your countries. I think the second thing is that's really important is actually getting value for money from what countries are doing. As I said, you know, it's not about the absolute level of money, it's about how good the results are with the money that you have. And you don't know that unless you are measuring constantly what the results are and getting that feedback loop. So that's really, really important. So I actually think a lot of it comes from actually making sure, you know, I mean, one of the things I've sort of come to the conclusion that from this discussion about the index and our engagement with policymakers is that they know intuitively that this is important. But what they don't have is a good sense of how well they're doing. So you guys can actually get out there and actually engage with countries and look at where countries can make improvements. I mentioned earlier that the data is gender disaggregated, and that's a really important part of the conversation as well, is who's not doing so well, and why is it important for the society for those results to be improved for everybody.
And so you mentioned earlier the importance of getting that information out for the wider audience and youth to actually have an impact as well on improving human capital in their countries. And it so happens at the Youth Summit, we organize a competition in which we encourage young entrepreneurs from all around the world to submit ideas on human potential and how they can increase it in their countries or in their communities. And you talked a little bit about technology earlier, and a lot of our finalists' proposals actually are technology-based solutions. So for instance, we have a platform which uses blockchain to help refugees. We have an automated system that encourages immunization in Africa. I am curious to hear what is your view on the best ways we can harness technology to increase human capital?
Well, I think technology is part of what's driving the complexity in the world, which is actually creating more demand for better human capital. So that it helps firstly at the aggregate level in that sense, because it is actually really bringing this discussion back to the sort of top of everybody's minds. And it's our job to keep it there as well. So that's the first part. But more directly, I think there's a lot that countries can do by using technology cleverly, and that's because there's in a lot of countries, services don't work very well for people, and we know from the data that we have that. So, for example, health and education services, there's some pretty serious gaps in coverage still, and even more, we're learning a lot more about the quality, the mixed quality of a lot of the services that people are getting, and particularly in middle income and low income countries. Not exclusively, some countries do a lot better than others, and some have improved much faster. But we know, for example, that in developing countries, after 4 years of education, 60% of the kids can't read a full paragraph or solve a simple math problem. So that's pretty damning. And it's, in some ways, it's not a surprise, because we know that firstly there's weak capacity in a lot of countries, so that the teachers are themselves the products of a poor education system, so they're struggling even before they've started learning to teach in terms of their own education levels. Similarly, we see some, we undertake surveys in health services, and in some of the countries we've surveyed, in 7 countries, half the patients presenting with the 5 most common conditions were misdiagnosed. So you have a 50% chance of getting a correct diagnosis and hence correct treatment. So a lot of policymakers are actually looking for solutions that will help these challenged health workers or teachers to actually be able to deliver better services quickly. And technology may be able to help here. So I think the more that we have of generating ideas, but testing them in developing countries where resources are constrained, to find those which can actually be taken to scale are really important. But they're also, so those are the capacity challenges, but there are also governance challenges. So for example, there's a lot of places where teachers don't necessarily show up, and if teachers don't show up, the kids don't come to school. It's, it sort of follows. And so simple use of cell phone technology, in some of the countries, we're financing monitoring of teacher attendance using cell phones. And so the first thing we found in one place, that in one province of a particular country, 4,000 teachers had actually migrated, but were still drawing a salary. So they actually had migrated to the Gulf and were still drawing a salary. So there's a savings there. So that's a way of actually improving effectiveness. Secondly, when you started monitoring teacher attendance, the teacher attendance improved significantly, but more importantly, the kids' attendance actually improved even more. So simple technology can actually really help to reduce some of the most challenging problems that you have. There are some, I think, tremendous development successes using new technologies. So, for example, in India, who's here from India? Okay, you've got your Aadhaar card, which is an identification card. This was a biometric identification that has actually been developed in India, which has actually been able to be scaled up across many other developing countries in the world. And this enables services to be delivered, people to access benefits It can help to reduce fraud in government services. And it's helped to improve financial inclusion in countries. So this is actually a tremendous success and development of something that was started in one country that's actually been able to be scaled up in dozens of social programs around the world. And there's some other tremendous examples of that. You know, more and more, even in very conflict-ridden situations, it's possible for the bank to finance programs that deliver to people using electronic means. So we can get social safety nets in place for people who are in the most challenging situations because of technology, where we couldn't have done it previously.
And we actually have quite a few people in this room who are developing technology-based solutions or have ideas on projects to build on human development through these new technologies. And I think all of the youth in this room and watching online are eager to make change happen. But sometimes it can be difficult to even know where to start, even if you have these technological ideas and you have access to these technology platforms. So before we open it up to the audience for a few questions, I would like to hear your very practical advice for the youth in this room. What are some steps that we can take to ensure that our governments around the world actually invest in human capital?
Okay, well, I talked a little bit about the learning gap, and I think this is something that actually is probably relevant for every country here. Sorry, I've just popped this thing off here. I hope I'm not messing things up for our technology. I talked a little bit about this learning gap, and this is really, really interesting because this is the first time this data has been available. So, as I said, we've always, in international development, we've measured progress in enrollment years. So how many more years of enrollment have we got? And we've actually measured in the index up to a possible 14 years, which is the highest that you go to at the end of secondary school. And then when we put all the test scores that we had from around the world into a harmonized data set, and we were able to do that because there's a lot of overlap between the tests. And just to give you some concrete examples of some big and important countries around the world, you can see what it means. So hands up, who's here from Brazil? Okay, so in Brazil, what the index shows is that out of 11.7 years, so kids are in school an average of 11.7 years, they're receiving learning the equivalent of 7.6 years. So that's a learning gap of just over 4 years. So 4 years that the taxpayers of Brazil are paying for that kids are not learning. For Nigeria, who's here from Nigeria? Okay, so Nigeria for 8.2 years of schooling is translating into 4.2 years of learning. So this is the equivalent of a learning gap of 4 years. So about half of the years that kids are at school. And then Pakistan, very similar, out of a total of 8.8 years of schooling, the equivalent of 4.8 years of learning. Now, when you look at the data in these countries, and I haven't got the results here, but in lots of middle-income countries, what we're worried about in terms of enrollment is making sure that all kids get to school. And there's been a huge international effort to increase the enrollment of girls. And that's still a really big agenda around the world. But when we look at the learning, we also see a gender gap going in the opposite direction, turning up, where boys' learning outcomes are lagging behind girls. So in some countries, that gap is another year. And that's perhaps an issue that's been explored. So what I think, what advice do I have on what you can do with this? I mean, the first thing is to check how your country is doing, and I think I always sort of think that young people have multiple dimensions to your life. So of course you're all members of families. So what are the choices you're making in your family about you and your siblings and your kids if you have kids? Many of you are consumers or beneficiaries or students in the education system. So you actually are actually going through education systems where these learning gaps are actually happening. So you need to raise your voice here. Many of you are active by virtue of the fact that you're here. It suggests to me that you're all active in civil society. And so you have an opportunity to play a role through civil society organizations. So what I think our goal in the World Bank, when we produce data like this, is to try and help create a well-informed public policy discussion about why this is important and what will help countries to actually improve these results. We're in the business of trying to help countries grow and develop their way out of poverty. And we want to change two numbers. We want to reduce the level of absolute extreme poverty in the world, and we want to help raise the living standards of everybody, including the bottom 40%. So use us as a resource to help create a more informed public policy debate about the challenges in your country and what can be done. Now, one thing about health and education outcomes, they're often actually not even national level issues. Often they are issues at the provincial or the district or the state level. So in a way, government is even more close to where you live. So there is actually, I think, an opportunity here for us to partner with civil society and with young people. And actually, I don't know if any of you watched the Global Citizen, is it?
Global Citizen Festival.
Global Citizen Festival in
South Africa.
Johannesburg in the weekend. And my boss, Dr. Kim, the president of the World Bank, he basically said when he was young, he was told never to trust anybody over 30. And his advice for you is unchanged because these issues are affecting your future and the future of the kids coming behind you as well. These numbers are a reality for millions of young people on the planet today who have left school and who face challenges because they don't have good education, good skills, and they need to get jobs.
Thank you. I think we're all inspired to do our part in increasing human capital in our own countries when we go back to our communities after the Youth Summit. I'd like to open the floor now to the audience for a few questions. If you can line up. We don't have time. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm told that we don't have time for questions, unfortunately. I'm really sorry about that. But thank you so much, Annette, for joining us for this event. If you do have questions, please feel free to ask them on Twitter. We will answer as a community as well. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.